Hello, my name is Akim Harman, and I'm here with Professor Joan DeBardeleben of Carleton University to talk about the geopolitics of the European Union. Thanks for being here. What is geopolitics, and why does the concept point to an important dimension in analyzing European integration?
Well, I think we can think of geopolitics as how power is exercised within a certain geographic area. In other words, if politics is about power, when we think about geopolitics, we're adding geography to it. And so when we think about the location of the European Union, it's in a potentially rather unstable geographical location. If you look to the south, you've got Northern Africa, where we've had large refugee flows coming in. If you look to the Middle East, there's a lot of instability there. And there's a number of authoritarian governments that could cause problems for the EU if those governments destabilize or if they take some kind of actions that the EU sees as going against its value agenda. And then if you look to the east, well, it was a relatively more stable area right after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. But of course, recently it's become a very unstable region too with the war in Ukraine. And even before that, there were indications of instability. There are a number of frozen conflicts. There was a war between Russia and Georgia in 2008. And it's a region that's been characterized by a lot of change because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's an area in transformation. And anytime you're getting a lot of transformation, you have a potential for instability. So the European Union over time has had to reckon with the fact that its geographic region is if anything, becoming increasingly unstable, and therefore has to think about how to exercise its power in that context.
What geopolitical power does the EU hold both globally and in relation with neighboring states?
Well, I think there are two kinds of power that are the most important when we think about the EU in both contexts, both globally and regionally. And the first one is economic power, because of course the EU is a mighty economic actor. It's a large entity. These are strong economies. They carry a lot of punch especially in the neighborhood, but also globally. And they also set regulatory norms in many areas that other parts of the world have adopted. And because competence for trade lies at the EU level, this enables the EU to conclude trade agreements, which are a powerful incentive and a powerful tool of power. The second kind of power is what we call soft power, and particularly normative power. Soft power is the power of attractiveness. It's the idea that other countries may aspire to be like the EU in many ways, to be prosperous, stable economies where the population has a high standard of living. And this enables it enables the EU to have a certain influence because other countries therefore want to emulate or be close to the EU. And that links to normative power, which is the capacity of the EU therefore to set standards that other countries may adopt. Now, the one area where the EU is not so strong is in military power. The EU doesn't have its own army. It doesn't have a strong military capacity. It has to rely on the member states primarily in that arena. So we see this kind of mix of types of power, and to the extent that the EU can mobilize its economic and normative power, it has a better capacity to exercise geopolitical power.
You are an expert on the EU's relationship with Russia. What can we learn from this relationship, both before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and after, about the geopolitical power of the European Union?
Well, picking up on this idea of normative and economic power, I think the first we can learn is that the capacity of those instruments to be effective is limited. And it's particularly limited with authoritarian governments. Now, Russia has moved from being a sort of democratic government in the 1990s to being semi-authoritarian, and I think now we can say it's an authoritarian government. Because authoritarian governments are not as interested in adapting to some of the norms and rules that the EU has tried to put forth. In fact, Russia has resisted those and has seen that attempt of the EU to export its norms and its values as something offensive, which has caused tension in the relationship rather than bringing the kind of transformative effect that the EU had hoped for. So that, I think, is the first thing we can learn from this. And the second is that there are dangers of over-interdependency, especially with authoritarian states. And here, of course, the energy sector is the key arena where this has revealed itself as a real problem for the EU, having such a dependence on imports of gas and oil from Russia. Now, in the current period, I think what we can learn from it is the importance of alliances, and that the EU really has had to rely upon its alliance, particularly with North America, with the United States above all. And this, of course, operates largely through NATO. Because here, going back to the fact that the EU has weak military power, it has to look for other allies in terms of the capacity to respond to really intense kinds of geopolitical crises that might occur, such as the one with Russia right now.
In your view, how would the EU need to change to become a more powerful global actor?
Well, I think one thing that should have to happen is that the EU would need to be more unified, and that probably implies giving more power to the European Union in the foreign policy sphere. Now, already the European Union has a lot of power at the EU level in the economic sphere, but in the kind of political sphere, it doesn't, because member states have been very, very protective of their sovereignty in the area of foreign policy. And what this has meant is that sometimes it's difficult for the EU to develop a unified position. And when it's difficult for the EU to develop a unified position, that means it can't exercise its power effectively. Now, of course, this is a very thorny issue, because member states may have different interests in some regards. They themselves have different geographic locations. So countries that are closer to the Mediterranean are more concerned about problems with migration from northern Africa, whereas countries closer to Russia are more concerned about problems in that arena. And this can lead to bargaining and provide opportunities, but it also can be a difficult thing to work out. The second thing, I think, is for the EU to use its alliances more effectively and to try to expand the range of countries with which it has effective alliances, and also to be sure that the alliance with the United States and with North America stays strong. Now, this is not completely in the EU's control, as we saw during the Trump era in the United States, where there was a kind of move away in the United States from interest in Europe. So the EU has to, and also has the challenge of maintaining a degree of autonomy in these alliance structures. So in this area too, it's a balancing act, and it's not such an easy problem to resolve.
Are there any similarities between the EU as a geopolitical actor and Canada as a geopolitical actor? And if not, what are the main differences?
Well, there are some similarities, and I think they mainly rely in the area of goals. The objectives of the EU and Canada, in terms of how they want to exercise their geopolitical power, are quite similar. Both countries are committed to the international rule of law and to the promotion of human rights on a global basis. And they also are both committed to primarily using soft power to resolve problems. So hard power, it's not something that Canada has a lot of anyway in terms of military power, and we do have a military, but we aren't going to probably be able to exercise that too forcefully. But the EU has been kind of, just in its makeup, kind of averse to using that kind of method to exercise geopolitical power. So the two actors are very similar in all of those regards. But there are some important differences. And of course, the first one has already been alluded to, that Canada is a unified actor in foreign policy. The authority for foreign policy lies primarily, almost exclusively, except in some minor areas relating to Quebec, in the federal government. And of course, the EU is different there. And then the second big difference is the geographical location. Going back to geopolitics, geography, Canada sits next to the United States. It has one big neighbor that's more powerful than it is, and so it has to pay close attention to that alliance. It's a friendly country. It's a country with which we have an alliance. But the EU, on the other hand, has many neighbors and is in quite an unstable environment, at least in the current period. So these are some similarities and differences, but underlying all of that, overall, the relationship has been very cooperative and very mutually supportive in terms of exercising geopolitical power.
Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to chat about these topics.